Hey guys, welcome back. So at this point we're going to get into loops, which is also a control structure in PHP. We've got a while loop, we've got a do while loop, a for loop, a for each loop, and then we've got break and continue that we can use within those loops. So before we get started, if you still have the code from the previous video up, all we have to do is just select all of that and get rid of it, because we are going to start with new code. And we want to get rid of all the old code because it's just in the way. So, what we start with is the keyword while. And that starts our while loop. But without anything else, while isn't going to do a whole lot. So, the next thing we got to do is we got to do an open parentheses. And in the parentheses is going to be the expression that we want to evaluate. So, before we do anything else, let's create a variable so that we can evaluate that variable, okay? So, this variable we'll call my variable. Very creative, I know. And we're going to set that equal to 5. I don't know why, apparently I like the number 5. So, back in our while loop, which we haven't really finished, we're gonna create, we're gonna put an open bracket, okay, and press enter. So this will be the contents of our while loop, and right now our while loop has nothing in it, so it doesn't know what to do. So while what? While isn't gonna run at this point because there's nothing to evaluate. So we'll give it something to evaluate. Alright? So what we'll do is we're going to throw in our variable, so my variable is less than 10. And now our while loop has something to evaluate. Simple, right? So what happens here is while being a loop is going to execute iterations as many times as it needs to until the expression that you're evaluating returns true. So, false. So let me repeat that. The while loop is going to continue running iterations as long as this expression is a true expression. Once it's false, it'll move on to the next line of code. So, if we start with my variable equals 5, and then in our while loop, we put in my variable plus plus, meaning that with every iteration of the while loop, my variable is going to be increased by 1. So the first time that the while loop runs, it's going to say while my variable, so replace my variable with 5, while 5 is less than 10. Okay? 5 is less than 10, so let's do what's in the while loop. We're going to say my variable plus plus. So then my variable is now equal to 6. So then the loop runs again. While 6 is less than 10, my variable plus plus. Now my variable equals 7. So then while 7 is less than 10, again, keep going. So let's say that we're up at 9. While 9 is less than 10, my variable plus plus. So now my variable equals 10. So now when we go into our while loop and we say while 10 is less than 10, the while loop is going to go, what? Okay, well that's not true, so hey, let's go to the next line of code. Let's break out of this while loop, we're done with it, we finished what we needed to do, let's go and move on, and we are going to be at line 9. So that's how a while loop works, and this is the most basic example of a while loop. They can get a little more crazy, but this is generally what you do. You evaluate an expression until it's false, and then you move on with your code. So, a do while, okay? Do while loops are a little different. So let's erase this. We'll keep my variable. All right. So if we did a do while loop, we would start with the word do, and then do an open bracket and a close bracket. And then after the closing bracket, we would write while, and then we would have our while expression here. and then we would just put a semicolon at the end. So the while expression could be my variable is greater than 5, or is less than 5, or let's do greater than 5, just to kind of show you an example here. All right. So in the do section of our do while loop, we could do something like echo iteration, or my variable, and then we'll concatenate, my variable, and then we'll do my variable plus plus. Alright, so what happens here is, because the expression evaluation doesn't happen until after the first do, this first do is going to run. So it's going to echo out exactly one time. It's going to say echo my variable, and then it's going to attach whatever the value of my variable is. So it's going to print out to the screen my variable, and then the number 5. Then it's going to increment my variable, and now my variable equals 6. So, oh, well, I kind of just messed that up for myself. My variable is greater than 5, so it's going to continue to do, which is bad because we've now entered an endless loop, because every number after this is going to be greater than 5. So if you ever want to know what the limitation of your hardware is, run a loop like this and see how quickly it'll lock up for you. Either way, here's what we do. We say less than. Okay? So once we do this, we get my variable, 5. We increment my variable by 1. We get 6. My variable does not equal, or sorry, is not less than 5. So what that means is that it's going to get out, it's going to break out of that do while loop, because it has nothing left to do, okay? So in a scenario where you would use something like this, is where you would want the, actual, if you would want to do something before the loop happens, and then continue to happen as the loop continues, okay? So hopefully that makes sense, because because I am done with while loops now, and we're going to move on to the for loop. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask, because I probably haven't covered every single aspect of the while or the do while loop, even though there's not that much that you could really do. I mean, you could throw in some other things here, like instead of saying just my variable is less than 5, you could also say and, so you do a comparison and you say, or a logic and, right? And my variable is greater than 10, okay? Or sorry, greater than 1. That's how we would do that. So as long as my variable is greater than 1 and less than 5, we're going to do. Okay? So do while this is true. And you can also change this to or. So you could do my variable is less than 5 or it's greater than 1. Right. So again, let's move on. We're going to go into the for loop now. Okay? So the for loops, probably my favorites. Those are the ones I use most often. They're fun to use with arrays. So let me just kind of write out an example for you. You've probably seen this before and have wondered what the heck is going on here, why are there so many numbers, and I'm going to explain them all. So we've got for I equals 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus. And then we're going to echo I. Alright. So you're probably wondering, first of all, why are we setting I equal to 0 here? Why are we checking if I is less than 10? And why are we incrementing I? Or if you didn't know that plus plus meant to increment, then now you know that plus plus means we're going to increment whatever value I currently has by 1. And by the way, just a fun fact, that works for letters as well as numbers. So if you assign the letter A to a variable and you do that variable plus plus, it'll go to B and then C and then D and so on. So that's a fun little fact. Okay, so let's take this for loop apart a little bit. Okay, we've got 3 parameters in the for loop. The first part is the initialization expression. So basically we're declaring a variable named I, and we're setting it equal to 0. Okay, so that I variable only exists in this loop, and it's equal to 0 when the loop first starts. Okay, that's important. The next parameter is our actual test expression. Okay, so we've got I is less than 10. So we're saying, okay, we're going to start our for loop with I equals 0, and we want to continue to iterate our for loop and continue for it to run over and over and over again until I is no longer less than 10. So, or we can say this another way, run the for loop as long as I is less than 10. So I equals 0 less than 10, I equals 1 is less than 10, I equals 2 is less than 10. Once I equals 10, no more for loop. For loop's done. For loop will no longer run. It'll be done. It'll move on to line 7. Okay? So, the next parameter, alright, that is our modification expression. Okay? The modification expression allows us to basically increment our variable at each iteration. Okay? So we can increment it, we can decrement it, we can multiply it, whatever we want to do. This is how we modify our initialization expression. Okay, so whatever our initializer is, here is where it's modified. So this is how it begins, and this is what happens to it as it's running. Okay, and this is what's constantly being tested every time it runs. So every time this runs now, and I'm sure you can predict with what I've told you about for loops, what this is going to produce. Okay, so if you can't, then here's the answer to that. Every time an iteration runs, it's going to print out whatever the value of I is. The value of I is going to start at 0. That means our first line is going to be printed just 0. The next line is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 9, because when I equals 9, okay, we do plus plus. Then when it checks to see if I equals less than 10, it won't, because it'll be 10, because it'll have incremented I. Right? So there's one other way that you can make this work just slightly different, and that is if you put the plus plus before the I. So instead of writing I plus plus, you could do plus plus I. And what that does is it increments the value before the loop runs. So we get I equals 0, and then right away we say, okay, I equals 1 now because we've incremented. So then the first line is going to read 1. And then it'll actually count from 1 to 10 because it'll increment before it tests. Okay? So incrementation and then testing. The other way around is testing and then incrementation. Okay? So keep that in mind. That's really, really handy to know. So moving on from the for loop, there's another fun loop we can try. We have the for each loop. Okay? That one confuses a lot of people. Alright, so with for each loops, we usually use these in arrays or collections, lists, anything that is like a thing of things, right? So let's say you've got a list of students, and you've got a student object that you need to assign for each of the students in the array, and then do something with that object. You would then want to iterate over that array in a fashion so that you could easily just create a variable every time you iterate over another student in the array. So let's kind of mimic that. So we'll create an array and we'll call it students. And we'll just create it as a blank array. We're not going to put anything in it. And then we're going to start off with our for each. Okay? And our for each takes 2 parameters. Okay, we start with the array expression, so we do students as, and then for the value we'll do student, because for each student in students we're going to have a value of student, and then what's going to get assigned to that value of student is the iteration element in the array, or the element in the array of our current iteration. Okay, so we're stepping through the array without having to worry about index numbers. We're going to just iterate over it. Doesn't matter what index numbers there are, nothing. We're just going to assign every single iteration as a student object. Okay, so then from there, all we would have to do, let's say student has, let's say student is an array. Okay, and we want to echo out the name, and let's say name is one of the indexes in the student object array. We could simply do something like echo name and then dot and student, and then do this and then name. And keep in mind that is all pseudocode. This is not real because student really doesn't exist, because students doesn't have any value. It's just an array. But typically, to make this work, you would have an array in, you would design an array named student, then you would put things in it at index name, for instance. So you would do name and then a value for name and then store it in student, and you would store this array inside the students array for every student that you want to store in the students array. I hope that makes sense. I hope I didn't confuse anybody, but that's basically how you would use a for each loop. Okay, so the only other thing that I want to talk about are break and continues. So if you're running in a loop, something like for I equals 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus, and you're wanting to compare something. Let's say if I equals 3, so you're wanting to say, okay, well, if in this iteration does I equal 3? If it doesn't, I don't care. But if it does, then we want to echo something saying, hey, we found 3. And then we don't want to continue running this because we already found our 3, so we want to break. So what break does is it gets us out of this loop and allows us to finish doing what we were doing. Now we could just as easily have let this run, but it would have taken more processing power. Not a whole lot, it's a very, very simple loop, but in big projects this makes a big deal. So you don't want to have to spend any more time in a loop than you really have to. Like, once you get what you need out of a loop, you break out. You do not stay there longer than you need. Okay? That's one rule that I can tell you that is going to help you with your programming journey, is do not spend a lot of time in loops. Loops are bad. Loops make things run slow. They bog down your program. So fast, get in, get out, and be done with the loop. All right? Get what you need out of it and be done with it. All right, so the other keyword we want to go over, which is sort of the opposite of break, is going to be continue. So let's say, for instance, we do that same test case where we say if I equals 3, but instead of doing a break, we just say continue. And outside of this if statement is where we put echo the number is I. So what this would do is it would output the number is 0, the number is 1, the number is 2. Then it would skip over 3 and say the number is 4, because if this is true, then we just say continue, which means that we don't want to process anything after the word continue. We just want to go straight to the next iteration. So that means that, hey, we don't like 3, we don't want 3, we don't want to print 3 to the screen. How do we do that? Well, we tell the loop to just continue after it finds a 3. Say 3s don't exist. We continue and we just keep going. And that's it. That is the while loop, the do while loop, the for loop, the for each loop, the break and continue keywords, and you guys should be all up to speed on how to work with control structures. If, else, else if, switch, for loops, while loops, everything, okay? These are the fundamentals of programming. You practice these and everything else is just going to fall into place because this is how programming is done. So until next time.